There is a photograph taken at the Queen Mother's 100th birthday celebration in August 2000. The whole family assembled on the Buckingham Palace balcony for the kind of image that press offices exist to manufacture. Hats, gloves, waves, smiles calibrated to look spontaneous. The composition is so perfectly arranged that it barely reads as a real moment at all. And if you know where to look, off to the left of the frame, you can find Princess Margaret. She is in a wheelchair. She is wearing sunglasses, not as a fashion statement, because by that point both her eyes had been so badly damaged by strokes that she could not tolerate light without them. Her left hand is gloved to hide scarring from burns she had sustained stepping into a scalding bath, because the sensation in her feet was largely gone. She had suffered 3 strokes in 18 months. She had lost most of her peripheral vision. She could not walk unassisted. She was 69 years old, and she was smiling for the cameras at her mother's 100th birthday. Because that was the job. And the job did not pause because your body was dismantling itself. She would be dead in 18 months. The official story of Princess Margaret's decline is polite and brief. She had health problems in later life. She smoked too much, drank too much, lived too hard, paid the price. She died in February 2002 at 71, and the obituaries called her a tragic figure and moved on quickly. Because her mother followed her 6 weeks later and the press had fresher grief to file copy about. What the obituaries did not say, what the palace never confirmed, what the family maintained careful silence about, is that the last decade of Margaret's life was a slow and sometimes brutal unraveling, conducted almost entirely in private, by a woman who had spent 50 years being told her feelings were an inconvenience to the institution. This is that story. Not the Mustique version. Not the Roddy Llewellyn version. Not the Tony Armstrong-Jones version. Not the group Captain Peter Townsend version. Not any of the versions the tabloids have wrung dry over 6 decades. The last chapter. The one that started quietly in the early 1990s when the cameras had mostly moved on, and ended in a London hospital on a February morning when the Queen rushed to her sister's bedside and arrived too late. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Princess Margaret Rose Windsor arrived on August 21, 1930. At Glamis Castle in Scotland, the second daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, which meant she entered the world as a genuinely minor royal, 4th in line behind her uncle David, her father Bertie, and her sister Elizabeth. Nobody expected her to matter much dynastically. She was the spare's spare, the afterthought princess, and in a family where position determined everything from which room you entered, first, to how many column inches the newspapers gave you. That accident of birth would shape her entire existence in ways she spent decades pushing against and never entirely escaped. She was also, by every account that survives, the more naturally gifted of the 2 sisters. Wittier, more musical, quicker across a room full of strangers, readier with a line that landed. Her talent at the piano was the real thing, not royal amateur dabbling but genuine feeling. Good enough that professional musicians who played with her later in life said so without being asked. She could do impressions that made even the stuffiest courtiers laugh against their better judgment. She had a gift for mimicry, a completely unroyal willingness to be funny, and a very clear sense of how rooms worked. In the House of Windsor in the 1930s, all of this counted for considerably less than it would have counted for anywhere else. Then her uncle David abdicated in December 1936, and the architecture of her life rearranged without warning. Her father, the stammering, reluctant Duke of York, who had never wanted the crown, and who had given every outward sign of a man who would happily spend his life on the margins of royal life inspecting troops and shooting pheasants, became George VI overnight. And 6-year-old Margaret, who had been nobody in particular dynastically, suddenly found herself second in line to the throne, inhabitant of Buckingham Palace and sister to the future Queen of England. Elizabeth got the constitutional tutors and the careful grooming and the sense of purpose the role provided. Margaret got something nobody had designed for her. She got freedom, or at least its appearance. There was no instruction manual for what she was supposed to become, which meant she became whatever the moment called for, which turned out, most often, to be the most entertaining person in the room. The war years shaped both sisters in ways that are easy to underestimate from the distance of 80 years. Elizabeth drove ambulances and wore a uniform and performed the visible duties of an heir learning her trade. Margaret did what the family required of her, which was to appear at appropriate occasions and represent the idea of a young royal Britain could feel warmly about, and she did it well, because she was naturally good at the performance side of the job. What she was not being given was any preparation for the actual substance of a role, because the actual substance of her role had not been defined. She was going to be a princess forever, in the way the spare always is. And nobody in the palace apparatus in the 1940s had thought very hard about what that meant for the person living it. By the early 1950s, she was in her early 20s, extraordinary looking, socially magnetic, and already beginning to understand that the position she occupied came with a very specific set of freedoms and a much longer list of prohibitions. She could go to certain places. She could not go to others. She could be seen with certain people. She could not, under any circumstances, be seen making choices that embarrassed the family, the church, or the government, and those three entities together covered a very large portion of the available choices. The 1950s press loved her anyway. After the austerity of the war years, after rationing and bombed streets, and the long national exhaustion that followed, Margaret was precisely what Fleet Street required. Young, beautiful, photographed, leaving nightclubs and arriving at country house weekends, trailing cigarette smoke and good copy everywhere she went. She was the first modern royal in the sense we now understand the term. A person whose personal life the public felt entitled to follow, as though it were a serial they had subscribed to. Her romantic choices were treated as national events. Her outfits generated column inches. The places she was seen and the company she kept were reported with a breathlessness that would have seemed bizarre applied to anyone outside the family. She was aware of this and navigated it with what looked like effortless ease and was actually considerable skill. She knew exactly where the cameras were. She knew how much to give them and how much to withhold. She had learned this from watching her parents and her sister across her whole conscious life. And she was, whatever her other qualities, genuinely good at the performance of royalty. The first of the national events that would define her public story came in the form of Group Captain Peter Townsend. Townsend was an RAF war hero with a Distinguished Service Order and a bar to prove it, equerry to her father, 15 years her senior, and recently divorced from his wife Rosemary, after years of a marriage that had not survived the pressures of the war. He was warm, thoughtful, presentable in ways the palace approved of, and had spent years at the center of the royal household. Margaret had known him since she was a teenager. The feeling between them was, by every account from people who observed them, genuine. This was not a passing infatuation. She wanted to marry him. The Church of England said no. The Prime Minister said no. The Cabinet said no. The Dominion governments were consulted, and they said no. Every lever of constitutional power available in 1955 Britain was applied to the question of whether the Queen's sister could marry a divorced man, and every lever produced the same answer. Margaret issued a statement in October 1955. The palace helped draft it. She signed it and it was released, and the newspapers ran it on their front pages and called it noble and poignant, and then turned to other things. The statement gave up Townsend and gave up the marriage and gave up whatever future she had been imagining, in language that was formal and restrained, and gave nothing of the interior away. She was 25. She had watched duty eat the one thing she had most wanted. She would spend the rest of her life in complicated negotiation with that fact, never quite resolving it, never quite letting it go. The marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960 was, by most accounts, genuinely exciting for about 3 years. Tony, as everyone called him, was a photographer, a commoner, genuinely talented, funny, and not remotely the kind of man the royal establishment had expected her to choose, which was presumably part of the appeal. He was also, as it became apparent fairly quickly, a man constitutionally incapable of monogamy, possessed of a sharp and sometimes vicious tongue when the marriage started curdling, and not above leaving handwritten lists of things he found intolerable about his wife. Somewhere she was certain to find them. She was not easy, either. Margaret had grown up in a household where her feelings were managed rather than addressed, where the institution came first, and the individual was accommodated when there was time, which there frequently was not. That kind of upbringing produces a particular type of adult, demanding in private, imperious in ways she may not have always noticed, capable of warmth that could close without warning, leaving people who had felt included suddenly and inexplicably outside. Their children, David and Sarah, born in 1961 and 1964, grew up watching parents who were separately miserable in ways they made no particular effort to conceal from each other, even if they managed it for public occasions. The divorce came through in 1978, after years of open estrangement during which both of them had conducted separate lives with other people in ways the tabloids documented exhaustively. Tony married Lucy Lindsay Hogg within months. Margaret told interviewers, over the years, that she had made the marriage because the one she had wanted was taken from her. Whether that was entirely fair to Tony or entirely fair to herself, the available evidence cannot settle. What the divorce left her with, in practical terms, was an existence that looked from the outside like the ideal model of 1970s aristocratic hedonism. A Kensington Palace apartment, a house on Mustique, the Caribbean island, where the press treated her presence as a perpetual provocation, because she was warm and visibly enjoying herself there. And the British press has always found that combination slightly suspicious in women of a certain age and station. There were the famous late nights, the theatrical friends, the social circuit that ran on wit and proximity to royalty. Roddy Llewellyn, 17 years younger than her, became the relationship the tabloids spent years rendering into a crisis. The photographs of the two of them on Mustique in 1976 accelerated a press campaign that helped push the divorce forward. Because a separated princess sunbathing with a much younger man was exactly the story every editor wanted to print, whether or not it accurately described what was happening. Roddy was, by accounts from people who knew them both, a genuinely kind man who happened to love her at a point when she badly needed that. The tabloids wanted Peter Pan and the dissolute princess, and they printed that story until it replaced the real one. Margaret never entirely forgave the coverage. Not because the relationship was invented, but because it was flattened into something unrecognizable from what she had actually lived. The 1980s brought her into her 50s. The social life continued. The Mustique trips continued. The parties and the late nights, and the friends who were artists and writers and actors, people who were not required to be royal all the time, continued. She moved through the decade with a momentum that had its own logic. The logic of a person who had been given a narrow life and built something livable inside it. That life had real pleasures in it, which sometimes gets lost in the retrospective framing of Margaret as a cautionary tale. She loved music with a seriousness that went beyond enthusiasm. She loved good conversation and was one of the better conversationalists in any room she entered, which across her social circle meant she was competing with some genuinely formidable company. She had a gift for friendship of a particular kind, loyal and demanding and funny, and the people who were truly her friends, the ones who lasted across decades, described something that was worth having. She was not simply running away from duty. She was also running towards something. The late nights and the theatrical company and the Mustique light were not just escape. They were the shape of a life she had built, with the materials available. She was also smoking the same amount she had always smoked, which was a great deal. She had started in her teens. By the 1980s, she had been smoking heavily for 30-plus years, the kind of sustained volume that leaves evidence in the cardiovascular system that does not announce itself until it does. Suddenly, and with significant consequences, she drank. And while the quantity has been disputed and exaggerated by various sources across the years, nobody who knew her disputes that she drank, and that by her later 50s it had become more than it once was. These are not judgments. They are facts about a person who was managing a particular kind of life, with the particular coping mechanisms her generation and her class reached for, in the particular way that people do when they have spent decades being told that what they feel should be contained rather than addressed. In 1985, she had an operation to remove a section of her left lung. The palace said very little publicly. She recovered, returned to engagements, and continued as before. The smoking reduced somewhat, not completely. She was 55, and the body had issued its first formal warning. She heard it. She did not hear it loudly enough to change course entirely, which is very human, very understandable, and also, in retrospect, very consequential. By the early 1990s, the glamour that had made Margaret such reliable copy for 30 years was starting to cost more to maintain than it once had. She was in her early 60s. The Mustique trips became shorter. The nights ended earlier. The social circle, as social circles do when the people in them begin to age, contracted. Friends died, some drifted. The world she had inhabited so completely in the previous 2 decades had its own mortality, and she was watching it. She also watched the press turn its full attention to the next generation. Diana arrived as a tabloid phenomenon in the early 1980s and consumed oxygen at a rate that left very little for anyone else in the family. Margaret had been the glamorous royal, the scandalous one, the one who gave the newspapers what they needed. By the late 1980s, that role had been inherited entirely by someone 40 years younger, and Margaret occupied the strange position of being simultaneously famous and invisible, recognizable everywhere, and photographed almost nowhere. She had opinions about Diana. Those opinions have been reported differently by different sources over the years, ranging from genuine affection to chilly distance to something more complicated than either. What is consistent across accounts is that she watched the Diana phenomenon with the particular attention of someone who understood exactly how the machinery worked, who knew what it felt like to have your private life converted into a public entertainment, who had been through the tabloid processing plant decades earlier and come out the other side, changed in ways she had spent years understanding. She had been the most photographed royal of her generation, and she knew, with a precision born of experience, exactly what the photographers were doing to Diana and what it was costing her. She never commented publicly. Whatever she said privately has not made it to the record in any reliable form. She was, in this as in much else, considerably more discreet than the public version of her suggested. Diana's death in August 1997 affected Margaret in ways she did not discuss for the record. She had known Diana since she was a child, had watched the marriage, had watched the disintegration, had watched the coverage of the disintegration with the particular attention of someone who understood all its constituent parts. The week after the crash, when the palace was managing one of the most acute institutional crises in modern royal history, Margaret was in the background of every photograph but the center of none of them. She was 66. She had recently had the lung surgery, and she was watching an institution she had spent her life inside navigate the consequences of its own failures in real time. The early 1990s were also the years the rest of the royal family began its own spectacular public unraveling. Charles and Diana's marriage disintegrated on the front pages. Andrew and Sarah separated, then divorced and remarried. The Queen herself called 1992 her annus horribilis, a phrase that became famous partly because it was so perfectly calibrated, and partly because it captured something genuinely true about the year the institution had endured. Windsor Castle caught fire that November, a blaze that destroyed 100 rooms and was extinguished at a cost of £36 million. The question of who should pay for the repairs triggered a public debate about whether the monarchy was worth its cost that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Margaret watched all of it. She had opinions about all of it. She expressed those opinions to the people she trusted and said nothing for the public record, because she had learned across 50 years exactly what happened when you spoke to the press about matters of consequence, which was that they printed what suited them and left the rest. Through all of it, she was there but mostly out of frame, doing her engagements, appearing at the required occasions, operating with the same fundamental discipline the family imposed on all its members regardless of what was happening in the rest of their lives. Then in January 1998, at 67, she had a stroke. The palace described it as mild. She recovered well. She returned to public duties within weeks. The statement was brief, and the coverage was brief, and By the following month, the newspapers were writing about other things. What mild means in the clinical context of a cerebrovascular event is a relative term. A mild stroke is still a stroke, still a disruption of blood supply to the brain, still the kind of event that changes the landscape of what is possible going forward. The brain that has had one stroke carries a different risk profile than the brain that has not. The plumbing that failed once does not become more reliable for having failed. Margaret's left side was affected to a degree that left her walking differently. Her speech was initially affected, then improved. She adapted, because adapting was what she did, because not adapting was not a choice she had been raised to regard as available. The burns came next. The accounts of exactly when they happened vary slightly depending on the source. What is consistent is that she stepped into a bath that was too hot and could not register that it was too hot, because the strokes had begun damaging the neurological systems that tell you when temperature is dangerous. She scalded both feet severely enough that the healing took months and left scarring she would cover for the rest of her life. She began wearing gloves to public appearances, and nobody in the official record explained why. Think about that for a moment. A woman scalds her feet badly enough to require ongoing medical management and scar enough to require concealment, and the public response is to note that she seems to be wearing gloves lately and leave it at that. This is how the palace handles the bodies of its members, with a silence that is not quite concealment and not quite disclosure, but lives in the space between them, where the public is permitted to see that something has changed without being told what. In February 1999, she had a second stroke, more serious. Her left side was more significantly affected. Her vision began to be compromised. The palace again released a minimal statement. She was hospitalized, recovered to a degree, and when she appeared again at public occasions, she was moving with considerably more difficulty than before. The sunglasses that she would wear for the rest of her life began appearing at this point, not as style, not as eccentricity, but as medical necessity. The strokes were damaging her optic nerves. Bright light had become painful. She could not read without assistance. She was losing peripheral vision in ways that left the world looking to her like she was peering through a narrowing tunnel. She was 68 years old, and her world was literally contracting around her. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The people who were close to her in these years, household staff and friends and family members, whose have spoken in memoirs and interviews, and occasional unguarded moments in the decades since, describe two different Margarets operating simultaneously. One was the public Margaret, who continued to appear at things, continued to dress correctly, continued to say the right things to the people she met at engagements, continued to perform the role with a professionalism that the public rarely appreciated was costing her everything she had. The other was the private Margaret, who came home from these appearances exhausted in a way she had never previously been exhausted, who sat in the apartment at Kensington Palace and tried to rest enough to do it again the next time. The discipline required for this is not small. To appear in public when your vision is damaged and your body is unreliable and your feet hurt and the light itself is painful. To appear and smile and shake hands and say the appropriate things without letting any of that visible is a form of performance that most people will never be asked to produce. Margaret produced it at 68 and 69 and 70, with the consistency of someone who had been doing it since she was 6 years old, because she had been. She also retained, by every account that exists, her full intellectual self. The mind that the strokes were attacking from one direction was still there from the other direction. She still had opinions about everything, still delivered them without diplomatic softening, still wanted to talk about books and music and what was happening in the world, still had, in the words of people who visited her in her final years, exactly the same quality of attention she had always had. You felt, when she looked at you, that she was actually seeing you, actually interested in what you were seeing, actually present in the conversation. This is the detail that the official record consistently misses, because the official record of her final years is essentially the visible surface. The wheelchair, the gloves, the sunglasses. The brief statements about health scares. The interior, the person still operating inside the body that was failing, is mostly absent from the public account. Friends who came to read to her because her vision had deteriorated enough to make sustained reading difficult on her own, describe someone who chose specific books with particular reasons and wanted to discuss them afterward with the same forensic interest she had always brought to things she cared about. She had favorite authors. She had aesthetic positions. She was not vague or absent or diminished in the ways that the public narrative about aging and illness tends to imply. She was simply a person dealing with a body that had stopped cooperating, which is a different thing entirely. In June 2001, she had a third stroke. This one was more damaging than the previous two. Her sight was further compromised. The left side of her body, already weakened further. She required a wheelchair for anything beyond very short distances. Her ability to manage everyday tasks independently was reduced to a degree that meant she needed consistent help in ways she had not previously needed. She was 70 years old. The woman who had spent decades being one of the most physically striking people in any room she entered, who had moved through those rooms with the particular confidence of someone who understood exactly how to occupy space, was now navigating the world in a wheelchair with sunglasses and gloves. She went to the balcony for her mother's birthday anyway, because that is what you did, because the institution expected it, and she understood the institution's expectations better than most people alive at that point, having spent her entire life inside them. Because her mother was turning 100, and the photograph was important, and her not being in it would have generated a story she did not want generated. The smile in the photograph is doing real work, it always was. The Queen Mother's 100th birthday was August 2000. Margaret's third stroke came June 2001, so the timeline of the balcony photograph and the third stroke is closer than it might appear. Between the second and third strokes, she had 1 year. Between the third stroke and her death, she had 8 months. Those 8 months are largely unrecorded. What we know is that she spent them at Kensington Palace and made occasional trips as she was able. She saw her children. She spoke to her sister regularly, because speaking to her sister daily was something she had done her entire adult life and did not stop doing. She had visitors she was read to. She had the conversations she had always had. The ones where she said exactly what she thought and made it clear she expected the same in return. She did not give interviews. She had never given many, and in her final years she gave none. This was consistent with a lifelong pattern. Margaret's relationship with the press was adversarial in a way that went deeper than the usual royal wariness. The press had taken her most painful moments, the Townsend affair, the divorce, the Mustique photographs, and processed them into entertainment at her direct expense. She had learned early that there was no version of self-disclosure that the press would handle with care, and she had drawn the line accordingly. So the public knew almost nothing about what her final months actually looked like, which is in some ways a mercy, and in some ways a form of erasure. A woman who had spent decades being extraordinarily public, whose face and voice and choices had been front-page material across her whole adult life, became almost invisible in the period when her life was hardest. The palace's instinct toward what I'll call dignity maintenance, because that is the institutional term for it, meant that Margaret's condition was consistently described in the minimum required terms. Health problems, a stroke, recuperating well, continuing to rest. These are the phrases the statements used. And they are technically accurate in the way that technically accurate can still be deeply incomplete. The gap between what was true and what was publicly said is not a conspiracy. It is worth being clear about that, because the conspiracy framing flattens something more mundane and in some ways more interesting. The palace does not manage medical information about its members through calculated deception. It manages it through a structural assumption that the institution's dignity and the individual's privacy are the same thing, that protecting one protects the other. The problem is that they are not always the same thing. Margaret's privacy in her final years served her and also served the institution, and those interests were aligned most of the time, but not identical. When the palace chose not to explain the gloves, not to describe the extent of the vision loss, not to characterize the wheelchair as the medical necessity it was, rather than allowing people to assume it was an occasional convenience. It was protecting both Margaret's wish not to be seen as diminished and the institution's wish not to have the public watching a princess deteriorate on camera. She would have wanted the privacy. Of that, nobody who knew her has expressed doubt. She was constitutionally opposed to being an object of pity. The image she had maintained of herself, across 70 years, and a great deal of TV material the tabloids had given the public to work with, was not one of a woman who needed looking after. Being seen in need of care, of assistance, of management, was intolerable to her in a way that went to the center of her identity. This is understandable, and also possibly a way of not getting the help she might have benefited from, if help had been more visible and more discussed. That is a complicated thought, and I am not sure where it lands. The people who were around her in those years say she was not lacking for care. She had staff, she had family, she had friends who came and sat with her. What she may have lacked or declined to access is harder to know from the outside. She died on February 9, 2002. She was at the King Edward VII Hospital in London, admitted following what was described as a further stroke. The Queen was informed that her sister was dying and traveled to the hospital. She arrived after Margaret was gone. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure. She was 71 years old. The Queen Mother died 6 weeks later on March 30 at 101. The closeness of the two deaths meant the country processed them almost as a single event. A generation of royals passing together, which suited no one's feelings but suited the press's need for narrative shape. Margaret's particular story was absorbed into the larger story, and the specific details of her final decline were never examined very closely by anyone with a platform and a readership. Her funeral was held at Windsor, deliberately and appropriately small by royal standards. Her ashes were interred in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel. 2 years later, in 2002, at her own prior request, they were moved to be placed alongside her father, George VI, in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor. She spent her whole life in father's shadow, professionally and dynastically, never quite able to step out of the orbit the accident of his kingship had put her in. She asked to be buried next to him. That request tells you something about what she valued. Underneath all the performances and the late nights, and the cigarette smoke, and the grand entrances, and the carefully cultivated mystique, she was her father's daughter. She just happened to be the one who could not inherit what that meant. Let me try to answer the question that this story always eventually arrives at. Who was Princess Margaret, actually? Not the nightclub version, not the tragic romance version, not the difficult sister version that television productions keep returning to because it has clean, dramatic shape. The actual person. The tabloid version, built over 50 years, says she was a woman of squandered potential. Someone who could have been something more if she had accepted her limitations more gracefully, who chose pleasure over duty, who smoked and drank and partied and paid the biological price for it. This version is the one that the obituaries reached for most readily. It has the advantage of being coherent, and the disadvantage of explaining very little. The revisionist version, which has gained ground as more people who knew her have spoken, frames her as a victim of an institution that gave her no meaningful role and then blamed her for filling the vacuum with whatever she could find. This version is also coherent and also explains less than it seems to. What I come away with, after reading everything available about the last decade of her life, is something that fits neither frame. She was a person who had been given a position that came with enormous privilege and simultaneously stripped her of the basic ability to choose her own path in any meaningful direction. The man she loved at 25 was declared impossible. The marriage she made at 29 corroded into something damaging for everyone inside it. The relationships she formed afterward were turned into tabloid entertainment without her permission. The talents she genuinely had, and they were real and documented, had no obvious institutional outlet because no one had decided what a princess who was not going to be queen was actually for, beyond appearing at things and not embarrassing anyone. She embarrassed the family regularly. The family mostly absorbed it because the alternative was acknowledging that the system that produced Margaret's discontent was the same system the family's legitimacy depended on. So she was contained rather than addressed, managed rather than understood, and the gap between what she was and what the institution permitted her to be quietly accumulated across decades into the kind of wound that does not announce itself until it does. She was also difficult. Her daughter Sarah has said this, gently and with evident love, in interviews over the years, demanding of attention in ways that could be exhausting, uneven with warmth, capable of making you feel entirely seen, and then, without apparent cause, entirely invisible. These are qualities that tend to develop in people who grew up in households where love was present but conditional, where the child's emotional requirements were addressed when the schedule permitted, which it frequently did not. She never had a therapist, as far as anyone has reported. She would not have gone. The vocabulary for that kind of self-examination was not part of the world she had been raised in, and by the time it became more culturally available, she was too fixed in her understanding of what strength required to find it useful. Strength, in the world she had been formed by, looked like not showing what hurt. She had absorbed that lesson completely. What she had instead was the reading, and the music, and the piano she kept playing into her 60s, and the friendships that lasted, and the children who came to be with her at the end, and her sister on the other end of the telephone every day. The relationship between Margaret and Elizabeth is the one that every dramatization reduces to a single dynamic: the free one and the dutiful one, the rebellious one and the responsible one. And it is the reduction that does the most damage to the actual story, because the actual relationship was not a diagram. It was 50+ years of two people who shared something no one else on earth shared, who knew exactly what the other's life felt like from the inside, who argued about significant things across decades and still spoke every day. Elizabeth was the queen, and that was always there. That asymmetry of role and obligation and public weight was always present in the room between them. But Elizabeth was also her sister, the person who had been in the next room at Buckingham Palace when the family found out their uncle had abdicated, the person who had been there for the Townsend years and the Tony years and the Mustique years and every year after. The shared history of that particular childhood is not something you can replicate with anyone else, and neither of them had anyone else who had lived it. When Margaret was in her final months, Elizabeth came when she could. The Queen's schedule is not her own. That is the fundamental truth of the role. But the people who were around Margaret in those final months say Elizabeth was present in ways that mattered. The phone calls continued. The visits happened. Whatever the public narrative about tension and distance between them across the decades, the final chapter does not support the version where they were estranged. The version supported by the evidence is two very old sisters dealing with what was coming, in the only way their upbringing had given them for dealing with things, which was with extraordinary composure and very little said out loud. When Margaret died and the Queen arrived too late and sat with her sister's body in the hospital room, whatever passed between them in that room, in the obvious sense of nothing passing because her sister was gone, is private in a way that should stay private. It belongs to Elizabeth, not to the record. What was said publicly afterward was almost nothing. The statement was brief. The arrangements were made. The funeral was quiet. The Queen attended, and her face did what her face had been trained to do since childhood, which was to reveal the minimum that the moment required and contain the rest. 6 weeks later, she walked behind her mother's coffin. 70 years of sitting on the throne. And two of the people she had loved longest died within weeks of each other before she was done. She had 20 more years of the job ahead of her. She did every one of them. There is one more thing worth saying about Margaret's final years, which is about what they looked like from the insides rather than the outside, based on everything that has been said by people who were there. She was not, by the available accounts, a person in despair. She was a person dealing with a difficult situation using the tools she had, which were considerable even when the body had stopped cooperating. She was funny. People who visited her in those months consistently say this, that she was still funny, still sharp, still capable of the line that made you inhale. She was also clear-eyed about her situation in a way that the stoic performance could conceal, but did not eliminate. She knew what was happening. She was not told things were fine when they were not. The people around her did not manage her in the infantilizing way that sometimes surrounds serious illness. She remained to the end, someone whose opinions about her own circumstances were solicited and considered. The gloves she wore, the sunglasses she needed, the wheelchair she required, these were managed as facts, not tragedies, because she insisted they be managed that way. She refused to perform suffering in the same way she had spent her whole life, refusing to perform contentment she did not feel. Both refusals came from the same place, a deeply held position that the performance of her interior life was hers to control and nobody else's. The burning irony of that position, held across 70 years, is that she was born into a family and an institution whose entire purpose was to manage the performance of its members' interior lives on behalf of the public. She pushed against that management harder than any other member of her generation and was punished repeatedly for it and kept pushing anyway, because stopping would have meant becoming something she was not willing to become. She was not a saint. The word abrasive comes up in accounts from people who found her difficult. She could be cutting. She could be demanding in ways that were not always fair to the people being demanded from. She had a capacity for cruelty in conversation that she did not always bother to suppress, and the targets of it sometimes included people who had done nothing to deserve it beyond being within range. She was also capable of genuine warmth. The people who experienced that warmth tend to speak about it with a specificity that tells you it was not generic, not the performed charm of a person who has been trained to seem interested. She actually looked at you. She actually heard what you said. She remembered it. She followed up. The attention she gave when she gave it was real. Both of these things were true. The people who knew her longest tend to hold both without trying to resolve the contradiction, because the contradiction was the person. I want to end with something small, because the small details are where people actually live, not in the official statements or the balcony photographs or the carefully managed public narrative. When her vision made sustained reading difficult, she had people come to read to her. This is documented in multiple accounts. Friends, household staff, people she trusted with the intimacy of being in her apartment and reading aloud to her for hours at a time. She chose specific books. She had requests. She was not passive in the experience. She would stop the reader to comment, to disagree, to make a connection to something else she had read or something that had happened. The reading sessions were, by every account, not a patient being kept occupied. They were conversations with a person who happened to be receiving the text through someone else's voice rather than her own eyes. She had always loved being read to, and she had always loved discussing what she heard. This continued until very close to the end. There is something in that, something about the continuity of the self, even when the body is withdrawing. Something about what persists when almost everything else has been reduced. The Margaret who sat in a chair in Kensington Palace and listened to a book being read aloud and then wanted to argue about it was recognizably the same person who had argued about everything in every room she had ever occupied since childhood. The strokes had taken things from her. They had not taken that. She would have considered it undignified to dwell on what they had taken. So she focused on what remained, which was substantial, and she kept going in the only direction available, which was forward, one day at a time, until there were no more days. The container of water from Lord Detail, which gets told about her mother Frances in the Diana story, has its own parallel in Margaret's life. The things people hold on to when everything else becomes unreliable. She had her faith, which deepened in her later years in ways she did not discuss publicly, but which her friends mentioned consistently. She had her music, as long as she could manage it. She had her conversations. She had her sister. She had a life that looked from the outside like a long series of disappointments interrupted by glamour and closed by illness, and looked from the inside, by the available evidence, like something more than that. Something that she had made, inside the very narrow room the institution gave her to work with, that was genuinely hers. That is not a vindication and it is not a tragedy. It is a life. Imperfect, complicated, often painful, sometimes magnificent, thoroughly human. Her grave at Windsor is shared with her father. The Memorial Chapel is not a public tourist stop. You have to know to look for it. Most people don't look for Margaret anymore. The tabloids have newer subjects. The television dramas have moved past her. She belongs to a generation that is almost entirely gone now. The generation that grew up in the war and inherited its aftermath, and carried the weight of an institution that treated them as its instruments rather than its people. She was one of its instruments. She also refused, consistently and loudly and at real personal cost, to be only that. The Queen Mother turned 100 in August 2000. Margaret was in a wheelchair at the balcony, wearing gloves and sunglasses, smiling for the photograph. 18 months later, she was gone. 6 weeks after that, her mother followed. The palace released a statement when Margaret died that described her as a woman who had lived life to the full. That phrase is technically accurate and almost completely uninformative about the actual person. She was the woman who burned her feet in a bath because her nervous system had started lying to her, who put gloves on and went to her mother's birthday party anyway, who listened to books being read aloud and argued about them from a chair, who called her sister every single day until she could not. She was not perfectly all right. She said she was, whenever we're asked, with an emphasis on perfectly that was always slightly too firm to convince anyone who was actually paying attention. Nobody in the institution ever quite figured out what to do with her. She never quite figured out what to do with the institution. They managed each other for 71 years. And then it was over, and the balcony photographs remained, and the wheelchair was there if you knew where to look. She would have hated this video, probably. She was not a woman who appreciated being discussed. Too bad. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.